European chat, how we call these like smaller discussion one-to-one. This European chat will be dedicated to Belarus, and we will discuss Belarus' future perspectives in Russia's shadow. So give us 1 minute so we can set the scene for the next discussion. This debate, one-to-one, will be moderated by Jamie Fly, President and Chief Executive Officer of Radio Free Europe, and the European chat will be with Mr. Vladimir Ostapenko, Deputy Head of the National Crisis Management of Belarus and Head of Mission of Democratic Belarus in Brussels. So I would like to ask gentlemen to take their seats, and as soon as we are ready, we can start discussing the situation in Belarus. Okay. So I would like to ask our audience to take seats again so we can start with discussions, and I am very happy that I can pass the floor to Jamie Fly, President and Chief Executive Officer of Radio Free Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's quite a leap from the previous topic, so we're going in a completely different direction, talking about Belarus for the next 20 minutes. As was noted, I'm from Radio Free Europe. We're based here in Prague. We're a multimedia news organization that serves audiences in countries where journalism is under attack. And one of our important markets is Belarus, where we've had significant challenges over the last several years. I'm very pleased to be able to discuss Belarus's future perspectives with Vladimir Ostapenko. He's the Deputy Head of the National Crisis Management Team of Belarus and Head of Mission for Democratic Belarus in Brussels. He has an interesting background because he has a long government experience with government service, working as a diplomat, as ambassador to a number of countries. And in 2020, when he was ambassador in Argentina and protests were breaking out across Belarus, he took a stand and resigned from his post, saying at the time that he believes in a better future for the Belarusian people. And since then, he's been involved in a number of the efforts outside of Belarus as Deputy Representative for Foreign Affairs at the United Transitional Cabinet. And last month, he was appointed by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as the head of the Mission for Democratic Belarus in Brussels. So I'm going to ask him a few questions. I think you know, those of you who have been here know the drill. If you have your own questions, go to the website and enter them there at Slido, and I will try to get those into the conversation as well. So Vladimir, I maybe just wanted to start with that moment 2 years ago when you made the decision to resign from government service. And can you just say a little bit about what your calculations were, why you decided that that was the moment to take a stand, and then also maybe reflect on why more Belarusian government officials have not done the same in the years that have followed?
Well, thank you for the question. Good afternoon to everybody. It could be a very long story, but I'll try to keep it short. We have a very specific situation in Belarus. Basically, since the beginning of the independence period, we've got very interesting first few years of building the independent country. And then back in 1994, we elected by vast majority the president. It was the first president, young president at that time, very populistic by his mind, Lukashenko to the power. And since then, for now 24 years, we've been witnessing very many strange, different things which happened to the country, unfortunately. And I had my own different periods because I quit the diplomatic service at that moment. I have Steve here in the audience with whom we cooperated academically at that moment, trying to develop European studies, trying to develop European perspective for the country. Then at a certain moment I was invited back to the service when we had sort of the improvement of the relations of Belarus with the European Union, and the expectation at that time was that we will be able to build something real democratic on this path. And well, with all this understanding, I was serving either diplomatically or academically to the country, to the people. But when we come back to August 2020, it was clear to everybody in the country, and I believe to everybody in the world, that the voice of the Belarusians was really stolen at this election, that they massively voted against Lukashenko. And there was a protest vote in favor of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and immediately after that, rigged elections. Hundreds of thousands of Belarusians went out to the streets and were brutally repressed with all kinds of tortures, extrajudicial killings, massive and systematic human rights violations. And it was, for me, at least at that moment, it was difficult to stay in the post pretending to represent a person who basically lied to its own people, who basically lied to the whole world, who pretended falsely that he is still the man to run the country. And, well, basically, I was not calculating that. I just presented my resignation by guided by the values and the emotions, maybe. There were other colleagues from the diplomatic service, starting from the ambassador in Slovakia, who spoke out against the violence and was dismissed immediately. There was another ambassador from Latvia who calculated the votes during the elections procedures correctly, not in favor of Lukashenko, and he was dismissed immediately. I was not waiting for my dismissal, so I presented this resignation. I never heard anything formal back from the capital. The only order that I got was to call me back to the ministry without any reasons and without anything specific. But, well, we know how it happens to all those who spoke against Lukashenko. Most of the leaders of our protest movement, well, we could say revolution, but revolution is still going on, are now either in jail for serving 10, 15, 20 years or forced in exile.
You were talking about that period a little bit more than 2 years ago that was very optimistic. People were hopeful. There were protests on the streets. We at Radio Free Europe were covering those protests from inside Belarus. But now we have a very different situation. You've had Russian troops that have gone into Ukraine from Belarusian territory. You've had strikes on Ukraine from Belarusian territory, and reportedly attempts by the Kremlin to try to get Belarus to join the war. And we already have a question online about this. So how has Ukraine and the war in Ukraine changed the situation? Obviously, there's not that momentum right now. And what are your reflections on the impact the war has had on Belarus and on those of you fighting for Belarusian freedom from outside?
Oh, definitely. The war in Ukraine changed everything in our vision and our understanding and our perspectives, because the first reaction to the beginning of the war was the declaration of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and other democratic leaders abroad, definitely, to set up a cabinet or a structure that would stand for the independence and sovereignty of Belarus, because, well, judging from our perspective, we see that the sovereignty of the country is under great, great threat. It was under certain threat earlier. There were some different moves and different actions that could be estimated like that. But I mean, with the beginning of the war, and we know that Lukashenko, regime of Lukashenko, was a complicit in this war, crime of aggression against Ukraine, providing all his infrastructure, providing all his facilities to help the Russian aggression from the territory of Belarus. And as you may know, this is the shortest route to Kiev, and that route was actually used at the beginning of this campaign by the Russian aggressors. So we took a decision to set up a structure that would stand for the independence and sovereignty of Belarus, and we still believe that the threat is there, and the threat is not diminishing. The threat is not evaporating, because Lukashenko is selling out his sovereign rights in different spheres. Definitely has no sovereign rights in the political and military sphere, because judging by our information, and we have this from different sources, Russian troops moved to the territory of Belarus in January under the pretext of the military exercises. Then they occupied different airfields, bases, routes, and then they took any decisions they wanted without any reference to local authorities or to national legislation or to our constitution that basically prohibits any aggressive acts from the territory of Belarus. And here we need to really draw a line between the regime of Lukashenko, which we believe is illegitimate, has no right to represent the people in the international arena, and the people of Belarus, because vast majority of the people, like more than 90%, are against this war, are against the involvement of Belarus in those operations. And Lukashenko knows that, and Russia knows that, and well, the Ukrainians know that, but still the actions, unfortunately, being implemented from the territory of Belarus put our country even into a bigger danger of, I don't know what, response strikes or real involvement of the troops. This perspective we cannot exclude for the moment.
We have a question online that actually asks, do you believe that Belarus is still an independent sovereign country? And I would add, is it just an extension of the Kremlin at this point? How far do you think Lukashenko has gone in giving up sovereignty?
Well, it's a question for the big debate. Of course, formally, it's a sovereign country and has its place in the United Nations, and still the representatives of Lukashenko are voting against with Russia and some other few countries for the anti-Ukrainian resolutions, etc. But we believe, and this is another point to discuss, that Belarus should be considered as the occupied territory. Partially occupied, hybridly occupied, because basically Lukashenko let the foreign troops to enter to the territory, and they have practically complete freedom of doing whatever they want. And so the regime of Lukashenko could be considered as the puppet government with the occupation power in Kremlin, and he is still selling this independence, unfortunately. That's why we believe that we need to stand for the sovereignty of Belarus, and we need to have structures that would be able to support this notion. And basically, of course, we need the support of the international community to keep our country independent. And I believe this is important for the regional stability, for the regional security, and, well, for the prosperous future.
One tool the international community continues to turn to is sanctions from the US, from the EU, from others. Sanctions are always controversial, obviously. They can often affect the population. And so what is your assessment about the sanctions that have been imposed thus far? And what is the position of those of you who are working and engaging with the EU about whether more sanctions are needed?
Well, it's a complicated question indeed. I would cite one of the European leaders who said that the reaction of the international community with the sanctions on Belarus was too little, too late. Because when we have hundreds of thousands of Belarusians in the streets in autumn 2020, there were no sanctions at all. And there were massive and systematic violations of human rights on every corner. And they are still going on. Say two years ago, we have about 100 political prisoners, and that figure looked, well, unprecedented for the Europe in the 21st century. So such a big number of political prisoners. Now we have 1,400. So this figure practically increased tenfold. All civil society organizations were eliminated. All independent media were closed. Repressions are going on with the extreme scale. Lukashenko is ignoring all obligations, internal and international, concerning the respect for human rights, concerning the neighborhood relations. And, I mean, he is facing the sanctions. but these are not the sanctions that would make the change in the situation. And another question now is the synchronization of the sanctions with, say, Russia, because Russia is considered to be the main aggressor in Ukraine, and most of the sanctions now are applied to Russia and not to Belarus. And it means that, well, whatever, Russian business, Russian citizens would have a very good escape from the Russian sanctions using the territory of Belarus. Maybe one more point I should add to that. We should not forget that the regime of Lukashenko is operating under this, or has been operating under the sanctions basically since the beginning of the century. And they know very well, they have know-how how to avoid the sanctions, how to build up schemes that would try to sort of evade all the difficult consequences. Although, in general, I may say that, yes, the sanctions that have been adopted till the moment are starting making their effects. Of course, it complicates the life of the citizen. It brings down all the economic figures like GDP growth, inflation. But, well, the cumulative effects of these sanctions is still to come, I would say.
So what more beyond sanctions? You're running the office now in Brussels. What are you asking EU officials to do?
Well, we are about to run this office in Brussels, but I mean, what more? We believe, well, the main challenge that we have for the moment, we believe that Lukashenko has lost any right to represent the people of Belarus. And we still believe that the voice of Belarusians should be heard in the international arena. Therefore, we created in August 2022 this United Transitional Cabinet as a structure that would represent all the democratic forces of the Belarusian people, that would represent real national interests of Belarus, that would speak for the democratic future of Belarus. And we are seeking the possibility to establish working relations with all interested partners in the international arena. It could be, well, not de facto recognition, it could be de jure recognition. And we believe that the regime of Lukashenko should be delegitimized on the international arena, and democratic structures should represent the people of Belarus. And of course, this is one of the objectives of the mission that we set up in Brussels as the European capital. Another one would be soon opened in Prague. So I would expect that with the help of our sort of foreign representatives, we would be able to mobilize the international community for the support of the Belarusian protest, which has not gone, which is still there, and which is still going on.
So one final question, because we're almost out of time. When you resigned 2 years ago from your post, you talked about your confidence and hope in a better future for the Belarusian people. I'm just curious, are you still as hopeful and optimistic? And then a second part of that is, how much of this is actually in Belarusians' control? We had a question online about, isn't ultimately the solution in Moscow and some sort of change in Russia leading to change in Belarus? So how optimistic are you, and how much agency do Belarusians actually have at this point?
Well, personally, I'm optimistic. I'm 100% confident that the Belarus would have a better future. Yes, the people sort of have been sleeping for 8 years, but it has woke up. And this process, in my mind, is inevitable, and it will go on. Well, sooner or later, we'll have this transfer of power, and we'll have a chance to build our own country as we deserve, I would say. Of course, this threat of independence coming from Moscow is very real, and we should do our utmost to withstand it and to ensure that the Belarus would remain the sovereign and independent country in this world. And just maybe one small example, every day we are reading the news that people are jailed for posts, for likes, for comments. Yesterday, the regime took a decision to ban the national slogan "Живе Беларусь," which means "Viva Belarus." So as you imagine a country, a regime that forbids this phrase, and this was immediately picked up by different social media, and the people would repeat it and repeat it all over and all over again. And I'm sure that the Belarus will leave. So therefore, I would say, Живе Belarus, and long live Belarus.
That's a good note to end on, and certainly with Radio for Europe's history, we share that hope and optimism. We were once banned and illegal here in Czechoslovakia. We have 350 journalists working here in Prague every day, so it shows that things change. It just takes time. So thank you, Vladimir. Please join me in thanking Vladimir for his time and frank answers to my questions today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for participating. And I apologize, I know we didn't get to a few questions, but thanks for all of the active participation with questions. So I'll turn it back to the moderators.